The city of Blackwood was a place of perpetual shadow, its streets slick with an oil and rain mixture that never seemed to dry. Detective Alex Riley hated the night shift in this town, but it paid the bills, and tonight, the bill was a call that went beyond the usual domestic disturbance or convenience store stick-up.it. Started with a file, a cold case file dragged out of the deepest, dustiest corner of the Blackwood PD archives. The case was 3 years old, the disappearance of a 22-year-old college student named Clara Jennings. No body, no witnesses, no ransom note, just a locked apartment and a car parked neatly in her driveway. It had been chalked up as a runaway, a mental break, anything to keep the closure rate high. Riley, a lean man with eyes perpetually tired from years of staring into the dark side of humanity, was assigned to close out the paper trail, to officially stamp the file unsolved/inactive. A simple clerical task, meant for a rookie, not a seasoned detective. He was alone in the fluorescent-lit chill of the records room, the air thick with the smell of aging paper and stale coffee. He pulled the heavy cardboard box marked Jennings, C. 2022, onto the table. The silence of the station at 2 a.m. was profound, broken only by the rhythmic hiss of the old HVAC unit. He opened the box. Inside was a thick stack of police reports, interview transcripts, and grainy photographs. Standard stuff. Until he got to the evidence log. Item 17, personal journal, brown leather. Item 18, iPhone 13, locked. Item 19, small, unmarked flash drive. Riley frowned. He didn't remember a flash drive being part of the initial media frenzy, and it certainly wasn't mentioned in the closing statements. He dug around until his fingers brushed against a tiny plastic casing tucked into an inner manila envelope. The drive was jet black, no brand, no label. It felt strangely cold. He carried it up to his desk in the empty homicide office, the only sound the tap of his shoes on the polished concrete. He slid the drive into the USB port of his old desktop PC. The computer instantly recognized it, displaying a single, unmarked folder. Riley clicked, and the folder opened to reveal one file, do_not_open.mp4. Well, Riley muttered to the empty room, that's one way to title a movie. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the mouse. This was evidence, but the chain of custody was already hopelessly broken by its initial oversight. Curiosity, the silent killer of many a detective, won out. He double-clicked, the screen flickered. The video was not a professional recording, but a shaky, low-light shot from what looked like a phone or a body cam, pointed at a ceiling fan, spinning lazily. The only sound was a faint, almost imperceptible hum, like a distant engine idling. Then, the camera dropped, showing a cluttered desk, a half-finished bowl of ramen, and a textbook. Clara's apartment. The timestamp in the corner read 3:17 a.m., March 4, 2022, the exact time she was officially reported missing. The camera moved, jerky and uncontrolled, like it was being held by someone terrified and fumbling. It panned across the darkened living room. Empty, the camera stopped, focusing on the closed door to the hallway. And then, the inexplicable began. A tiny, almost microscopic click echoed from the speakers. On the screen, a shadow detached itself from the wall near the door. It wasn't the shadow of the camera holder. It was too tall, too narrow, and it moved against the ambient light. It was a perfect silhouette of a man, thin and elongated, but it cast no visible light source. It was pure, distilled darkness. The person holding the camera let out a small, choked gasp. Clara's voice, muffled and panicked. The shadow moved, slow and deliberate, sliding across the wall like paint. It reached the door, and then, impossibly, it began to seep underneath the gap. Not like a liquid, but like a ribbon of black smoke being pulled into the room. The video quality worsened as the camera operator frantically retreated backward. The shadow was fully in the room now, a tall, man-shaped hole in the light, standing still by the door. Riley leaned forward, his eyes burning. Then, the figure moved. Not walking, but stuttering forward, a rapid succession of jumps in position, like a corrupted frame rate. In 3 such moves, it was less than 5 feet from the lens. The camera dropped entirely. The screen went black, but the audio continued. A low, scraping sound, like fingernails on dry bone. Clara's voice, now a high-pitched, desperate whisper. "Who are you? What do you want?" A deep, inhumanly resonant sound, not a voice, but a vibration, filled the silence. It was a single, sustained chord of noise that made the hair on Riley's arm stand up. Then, silence. A profound, crushing silence that lasted for a solid minute. Just as Riley was about to stop the playback, a new sound came through. It was soft, close to the microphone. A slow, wet smack, then another, and finally, a calm, low hiss of a breath being drawn. The file cut off. Riley shot back in his chair, the squeak of the wheels shattering the oppressive silence of the office. His heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't a runaway. This wasn't a break-in. This was something else entirely. Something terrifying. He looked at the flash drive, now glowing with the faint activity light, and then back at the empty, dark hallway outside his office. He had just opened a cold case that wasn't about a missing person, but a victim of an unknown, silent thing. The archival paper trail was a lie. The real investigation had just begun. Riley sat frozen for a long moment, the afterimage of the elongated black figure burned onto his retinas. The silence of the precinct was now less comforting and more like a vacuum waiting to be filled by the sound on the recording. He rubbed the grit from his eyes, his professional instincts finally kicking in, overriding the primal fear. He was a detective. This was a piece of evidence. A horrifying, anomalous piece, but evidence nonetheless. He ejected the flash drive and slipped it into a sealed plastic bag retrieved from the evidence locker. Standard procedure. He knew, however, that treating this like a normal case would be pointless. He had to assume the source of the video, whatever that thing was real, and that the police reports dismissing Clara Jennings' case were tragically, fatally wrong. Riley grabbed Clara's journal, item 17, from the cardboard box. The leather cover was worn smooth. Flipping past the first few pages of mundane college life, study schedules, complaint about a philosophy professor, he reached a sudden shift in tone, dated roughly 2 months before her disappearance, January 10. I keep seeing the same reflection. Not mine. When I look in the window at night, after the lights are off, there's a figure standing behind me. It's always tall and thin, but it only lasts for a second. When I turn around, nothing. Just the dark room. I think I'm losing it. Sleep deprivation from finals, January 28. It's not sleep deprivation. I saw it outside my apartment window today, standing across the street by that old oak tree. It was daytime, but it was still just black. Like it was absorbing the sun. When a car drove by, its shadow was the only one that didn't move. Riley swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. The description matched the silhouette from the video perfectly. This wasn't a sudden, random attack. Clara had been observing this entity for weeks. She knew she was being watched. He looked at the next file in the evidence box, a poorly printed copy of an email from Clara to her older brother, Dean. Subject: need your advice. I'm scared, Dean. I know this sounds crazy, but I'm serious. I think someone is messing with me, or worse. I've been feeling watched inside my own place for almost 2 months. Things are moving when I leave the room. Yesterday, I swear I left the salt shaker in the cupboard, and when I came back, it was sitting in the middle of the kitchen table. No one has a key. I'm installing a hidden camera tonight. I need to know who is getting in, or if I should just call the cops. But honestly, if I tell them this, they'll lock me up. Please call me back. I'm starting to panic, love, Clara. The email's date stamp was March 3rd. The hidden camera, that had to be the phone that recorded the dio_not_open.mp4 file. Riley realized the horrifying implication. Clara hadn't just accidentally captured her own demise, she had deliberately set up surveillance, knowing her life was in danger from an invisible, silent intruder. Item 18, the locked iPhone, was the camera. Item 19, the flash drive, was the video evidence she managed to transfer and try to hide before the entity caught her. He picked up the phone receiver, the weight of the investigation suddenly heavy on his shoulders. He couldn't go through the official channels yet. He couldn't report a killer shadow monster to his captain. He dialed a private number, Dr. Evelyn Reed, the department's retired forensic psychologist, a sharp mind who specialized in fringe cases and pattern analysis, a woman with zero tolerance for bureaucratic nonsense. She answered on the second ring, her voice raspy from sleep. Riley? It's 3:30 a.m. Is someone dead? Yes, Evelyn. 3 years ago. But I just found the murder weapon. Riley kept his voice low and steady. I need you to come in. Unofficial, untraceable. I've got a case that's going to sound like a screenplay, and I need a professional analysis on the victim's psychological state and a piece of video evidence that defies reality. There was a long pause on the line. Then, Dr. Reed sighed, a sound of resigned exhaustion. Blackwood, you never fail to deliver the truly bizarre. I'm leaving now. Make coffee, and don't tell Captain Vance I'm here. Riley hung up and looked at the box on his desk, feeling a strange mix of dread and professional focus. He had just gone off book, putting his career on the line, but he knew he'd done the right thing. Clara Jennings was waiting for justice, and the silent watcher was still out there, possibly still watching. He had to find out how a shadow could kill a person, and if this was an isolated incident, or if the archives held more cases dismissed as runaways. The first stitch in the cold case was pulled. The unraveling was about to begin. By 4:15 a.m., Dr. Evelyn Reed, sharp and impeccably dressed even at this hour, was seated across from Riley's desk. She was a woman who commanded respect, her silver hair pulled back severely, her eyes capable of looking past the surface straight into the ugly core of a situation. Riley had the lights dimmed, relying only on the cone of light from his desk lamp. He needed the darkness for context, but it did little to settle the paranoia buzzing just beneath his skin. He placed the evidence, the journal, the email transcript, and the flash drive, before her. Start with the journal, Dr. Reed. Tell me what Clara Jennings was experiencing before you watched the video. Evelyn read the entries and the email quickly, her lips moving silently. She set the pages down with a definitive thump. Standard escalation of victim blaming, Riley, she stated, her voice calm and analytical. She was aware of the anomaly, sought rational explanations, sleep deprivation, failed to find them, and began internalizing the fear. The salt shaker incident? That's her mind demanding proof that she isn't crazy. When external reality didn't provide it, she created her own surveillance. She was terrified, but she was fighting back. Correct. And the fact she immediately backed up the evidence to this drive means she knew, in the final moments, that the threat was imminent and potentially lethal. She prioritized documenting the truth over escaping. Evelyn tapped the flash drive. Let's see the truth. Riley inserted the drive into the secure forensics laptop he kept locked in his desk, connecting the audio output to a pair of professional headphones for Dr. Reed. He didn't need to hear the sounds again, but she did. Evelyn put on the headphones, her expression neutral. Riley watched her face as the video played, her brow furrowed at the image of the spinning fan. Her eyes narrowed when the shadow detached itself from the wall. When the figure began its terrifying, stuttering approach, Riley saw the barest flicker of shock, a muscle twitching near her jaw. But she didn't flinch. When the video cut to black and the smack and the final, deep hiss came through the headphones, Evelyn finally pulled them off, her hands trembling slightly. "My God, Alex," she whispered, looking shaken for the first time. That is not human." "Analysis, Evelyn. Be objective," Riley urged, though his own objectivity was threadbare. Evelyn took a deep breath, collecting herself. Psychologically, the victim experienced a rapid, absolute terror response, transitioning from questioning to pure fight or flight in milliseconds. The choked gasp, the whispered questioning, she knew this was beyond human comprehension. And the entity? It's an absence. A visual vacuum. It behaves in ways that violate physics, seeping under a door, moving in rapid, spatial displacements. She rubbed her temples. But its behavior is calculated. It was observing her for months, testing her resolve, maybe even her sanity, with small movements of objects. It didn't want a quick kill, it wanted a prolonged hunt. Riley leaned forward, gripping the edge of his desk. "Tell me about the end. The final sounds." Evelyn's gaze drifted to the ceiling. The silence was crushing. But the sounds that followed, the scraping was likely movement on the floor near the phone. The wet smack could be anything, the victim struggling, the entity performing some action. But the final sound, she paused, choosing her words carefully. The final sound was a deliberate, controlled intake of air. A breath. If it's a void, a shadow, why does it need to breathe? It suggests it is organic, or that it is mimicking an organic function for intimidation. Riley pulled out a fresh notepad. "Okay. Clara was being stalked by a breathing shadow that appears to violate the laws of nature. If this is real, it can't be an isolated incident. I need to know if this pattern is visible in other cold cases. Blackwood PD has dozens of runaways and missing without trace files. What pattern are you looking for?" Evelyn challenged. "The initial reports," Riley said, tapping the journal. "We're looking for victims who reported subtle, domestic anomalies, objects moving, fleeting reflections, intense feelings of being watched, and the time of disappearance being between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. The witching hour, when they're alone and the station is quiet." Evelyn nodded, her eyes bright with renewed purpose. "A pattern of prey selection and territorial haunting. I can cross-reference the closed files for keywords that suggest pre-mortem paranoia. I'll need access to the digital archives." "I'll get you access," Riley confirmed. "While you do that, I'm going back to Clara Jennings' apartment. 3 years is a long time, but I need to see the kill zone. I need to find out what, if anything, the shadow left behind." He stood up, grabbing his jacket and his official investigation kit. The sun was still hours away from rising, and the city of Blackwood lay waiting, full of dark corners and silence. The previous investigation had stopped at the front door. Riley knew the real horror started the moment the shadow had seeped beneath it. Riley drove the patrol car silently through the pre-dawn darkness toward Clara Jennings' old neighborhood, a slightly dilapidated cluster of brick apartment buildings near the college campus. The streetlights cast long, shivering shadows across the wet asphalt. Every shadow now felt predatory. He had called the property manager, inventing a story about a routine re-examination of forgotten evidence, to gain access to Unit 209. The manager, half asleep and smelling of cheap whiskey, simply handed Riley a master key and grumbled, "Just lock up when you're done, detective. Place has been empty for 3 years. Nobody wants to rent a dead girl's apartment." The air inside the building was stagnant and cold. Riley climbed the stairs, the silence amplifying the squeak of his leather holster. He located 209 and slid the master key into the lock. The door swung inward with a heavy, protesting groan. The apartment was exactly as the initial reports described, neat, quiet, and profoundly empty. The police had documented everything, photographed the placement of furniture, and bagged superficial evidence. But they hadn't looked for a ghost. Riley pulled on a pair of latex gloves and walked straight to the kitchen table, the spot where Clara's journal mentioned the salt shaker anomaly. He pulled out a specialized UV light that he scanned the table, the chairs, the countertops. Nothing. The surface was clean. He moved to the front door, the place the entity had seeped in. He knelt down, shining the light along the baseboard and the gap beneath the door. The wood was clean, the carpet undisturbed. Then, Riley noticed something subtle, the metal threshold plate. It was secured by 4 small screws, 2 of which were slightly looser than the others. He retrieved a small screwdriver from his kit and carefully lifted the plate. Beneath the metal, there was a thin layer of dust and fine grit. And etched into the wood subfloor, so faint it was almost invisible, were 3 parallel lines, each about 2 inches long. They weren't scratched with a knife, they were more like deep indentations, slightly curved, the forensic equivalent of a smear. Riley photographed the marks from multiple angles. He thought back to the sound on the recording, the low, scraping sound. Could these be marks left by the entity? But what part of a shadow could leave physical damage to wood? He moved to the center of the living room, near where the camera, Clara's phone, must have dropped. He activated his olfactory senses, taking a long, slow breath. The apartment smelled of age and mildew, but beneath that, Riley detected a faint, earthy odor. Not dirt, but something richer, like decaying leaves mixed with ozone. He got down on his hands and knees and scanned the floor with his UV light again, moving slowly around the spot. Finally, about a foot from where the phone likely landed, the light caught something. Not a stain, but a slight discoloration in the wood grain of the floorboards. It was a dark, non-reflective patch, roughly circular, about the size of a dinner plate. Riley ran a gloved finger over the patch. It felt smoother than the surrounding varnished floor, yet somehow also drier. It was as if a patch of the wood's moisture had been completely and instantly leached away. He knew what this was, or what it felt like. A severe, localized energy drain. He looked up at the ceiling fan, the subject of the video's opening shot. He then looked at the hallway door where the shadow appeared. His eyes tracked the path the entity took across the living room to the spot on the floor where he now knelt. The kill zone, the spot of discoloration and the faint scraping marks near the door were the only tangible evidence of the entity's presence. The shadow had physically interacted with the environment, leaving an unnatural dryness and a curious set of scores. As Riley packed his samples and photographs, his phone buzzed. It was Dr. Reed. "Riley, you need to get back here. I've found something in the archives. I've been running keyword searches, moving objects, fleeting shadows. Feeling drained. It's a pattern, Alex. And it's not limited to Blackwood." Riley secured the apartment and rushed back to his car. "How many?" he asked, keying the ignition. "So far, across the state police archives for the last decade, I've found 5 disappearances matching Clara's initial paranoia profile," Evelyn stated, her voice tight with urgency. 5 people who vanished between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., all dismissed as runaways. And listen to this, every single one of them was found to have a small, localized power failure reported at their address on the night they vanished. Just a flicker, a brief outage. Riley gripped the steering wheel. A localized power drain. Like what? A short? "No," Evelyn said, her voice dropping. "More like the energy in that specific space was drawn out. Alex, if this thing is an absence, if it's a living shadow, it may not just be absorbing light. It might be absorbing energy itself to manifest. Riley looked at his dry, scraped samples in the evidence bag. An entity that drained moisture and energy to materialize. "I'm on my way, Evelyn," he said grimly. "We just upgraded the investigation from a missing person to a serial predator. A non-human one." The sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the sky with colors that seemed entirely too cheerful for the horror that was now unfolding. Riley burst back into the precinct, the morning light, usually a relief, now feeling like a false security. Dr. Reed had commandeered a large digital screen in the closed-off briefing room, scattering printouts and connecting lines on a regional map display. "The names, Alex," Evelyn stated, pointing to 5 digital folders displayed on the screen, labeled with the names of the vanished: Jones, 2018, Martel, 2019, Sanchez, 2020, Miller, 2021, Jennings, 2022. 5 disappearances, all sharing the pre-mortem anxiety profile and the 3 a.m. window. Riley put the bagged samples from Clara's apartment on the desk. Physical evidence from Clara's place confirms an extreme, localized energy draw. Dry patch on the floor, slight damage to the subfloor. "Now, tell me about the power failures." Evelyn zoomed in on the case files. All 5 reports have supplemental utility records, casually dismissed, noting a micro outage, or flicker lasting less than 5 seconds, geographically limited to the victim's building. "We never look for energy anomalies in homicide, but this is clearly part of the pattern. The entity drains energy to solidify itself," Riley mused. "But why these 5? They're spread out across 3 different counties." Evelyn tapped the map, showing the locations of the 5 victims, represented by blinking red dots. They appeared random, scattered across the greater Blackwood metropolitan area. "That's what I thought at first, too," Evelyn said, leaning closer to the screen. "But look at the city's historical data. I overlaid the original 1880s city planning documents. The current districts are built over the old town lines, and the apartment complexes are mostly on reclaimed land." She clicked a filter, and a series of faint, complex lines, the original 19th century municipal boundary markers, appeared over the modern map. The old town had 5 primary industrial zones, Alex. Tanneries, mills, smelting. All built over the main confluence points of 3 old waterways that were later diverted underground. These were the areas of peak physical, economic, and electrical activity in the old days. She zoomed out slowly. As the old boundary lines connected, a chilling pattern emerged. "Look." Evelyn traced the lines with her finger. Each of the 5 victim locations sits directly atop or within 50 feet of one of these original industrial confluence points. They were abandoned sites, then built over. Riley stared at the map. The 5 red dots, representing the vanished people, formed an irregular, 5-pointed shape, a dark, asymmetrical star spread across the region. "It's not choosing victims randomly," Riley stated, his voice barely a whisper. "It's choosing locations. It's tied to these old, high-energy spots." "Why? What was left there?" "Something about the ground itself, maybe," Evelyn suggested. "Or maybe something about the immense, concentrated activity and power drawn in those spots over 100 years ago. This thing is manifesting where the residual energy is strongest." She paused, clicking on the name Jones, 2018. The first victim, Thomas Jones, vanished from an apartment built over the old Blackwood Mill district. The mill ran on steam and massive amounts of localized electricity. "It's a territorial hunter tied to specific points of historical energy saturation," Riley concluded, feeling the cold weight of the case pressing in. "It's using these old centers to power its movements and materialize. And the pattern suggests a slow rotation, Evelyn added, pointing to the dates next to the names. 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022. It takes one victim every year, moving systematically from one confluence point to the next, circling the city like a slow clock. It's methodical, Alex. Too methodical for a random event. Riley looked at the sequence of dates. Clara Jennings was the last one. Clara was the fifth victim, he said, realization dawning with a sickening jolt. 5 points on the map. What happens now? Has it completed the rotation? Does it start over? Evelyn quickly checked the historical map. There are no other documented industrial confluence points of this scale. 5 was the limit of the old municipal power grid. Riley stood up, walking toward the window and looking out at the waking city. It took the last one in 2022. It's 2025. 3 years have passed since Clara. If the pattern is a strict annual rotation, why the silence now? Did we stop it by reopening the case? Did it finish what it started? Or, Evelyn said quietly, tapping the center of the dark, star-like shape on the map, did it move to the center? She highlighted the area where the lines of the old industrial zones intersected, the historical heart of Blackwood. This was the most congested, centralized district, the location of the Blackwood City Hall and the police department headquarters. Riley turned back, his blood running cold. They were standing directly on the site of the most significant energy convergence point of the entire 1880s city plan. The pattern didn't stop, Evelyn. It escalated. It's not rotating around the city anymore. It's here. The realization that their headquarters was the final, and most potent, center point of the entity's pattern hit Riley and Evelyn with physical force. If it's here, it's not hunting people in their homes anymore, Riley said, his hand gripping the edge of the table. It's feeding on a larger, more concentrated source of power. This building runs 24/7, lights, servers, communications, the archives. Evelyn's eyes darted around the briefing room, suddenly seeing the familiar office space as a hunting ground. And it's been 3 years since Clara. If the annual pattern was broken, it's because this location required a longer, slower process of energy absorption. It's consolidating power, Riley concluded. We need to confirm it's here, and we need to understand what its end goal is. We can use the energy signature, Evelyn suggested, pointing to the digital map. If it's drawing power, we can track the anomalies. I can set up a real-time monitoring program, a specialized sensor that measures ultra-low-frequency electromagnetic anomalies. If this shadow is energy-based, it will leave a ripple. Riley nodded, already pulling out his phone to call the chief engineer, a grizzled man named Frank who knew the labyrinthine depths of the building's infrastructure better than anyone. I need you to run a deep scan utility check on the entire building, Frank. Focus on the lowest sublevels, the unused conduits, the old boiler rooms, any place with residual, antique wiring. Riley kept his tone professional and vague. We're trying to track a faulty surge protector that's been throwing off our records. Frank, used to Riley's late-night eccentric demands, grumbled an agreement. While Evelyn began downloading specialized frequency software, Riley changed into his field gear. He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight, a powerful beam that cut through the darkness, and his sidearm, though he had zero confidence that standard-issue 9mm rounds would stop a breathing shadow. I'm going down, Riley told Evelyn. If this thing is feeding on residual energy, the best hiding place is the foundation. The lowest point, closest to the original confluence. Evelyn stopped typing. Alex, that's reckless. Go in a team. And report what? That I'm hunting a shadow monster beneath the police station? The time it takes to mobilize, this thing could slip away, or worse, retaliate. We keep this tight. Keep monitoring the electrical grid. If you see a major dip, any power anomaly, you call me immediately, then you get out. Riley took the emergency use elevator down to the basement, then found the marked door leading to the sublevel maintenance tunnels. He slid the heavy bolt and stepped through, the air immediately turning cold and humid, carrying the scent of damp concrete and rust. He followed the winding tunnels, the only sound the crunch of his boots on dried debris and the distant hiss of steam pipes. He passed dusty boiler rooms, massive air handling units, and miles of thick, unused electrical conduits wrapped like ancient vines. Finally, he reached the lowest point, a small, forgotten chamber marked only with a faded sign, Original City Drainage Access, 1883. Riley shone his light into the gloom. The room was round, the walls curved, and water dripped steadily from the ceiling, pooling in the center. But it wasn't the water that caught his attention. Lining the damp, stone walls were dozens of small, crude symbols painted in what looked like dried mud or rust. They were complex, non-alphabetic patterns, scratches, circles, and angular lines that reminded him unsettlingly of the stuttered movements of the entity. He brought his light to the floor. The center of the room, directly over what Evelyn believed was the heart of the energy confluence, was a large, circular patch of concrete that looked unnaturally smooth. It was surrounded by a fine, iridescent dust that glittered briefly in his beam. Riley knelt, pushing the dry, fine dust aside. Beneath it, the smooth concrete had a single, clear indentation, the impression of a deep, elongated footprint. Not a human foot. It was long, narrow, and lacked any toes, ending in a single, blunt point. He took a shaky breath. The shadow wasn't just solidifying here, it was resting here. This was its lair. Just then, his radio crackled, making him jump. It wasn't Evelyn. It was Frank, the engineer, his voice tight with panic. "Detective Riley. Get out of there. My system's going crazy." The core grid just registered a massive, instantaneous power drop, the main server racks, the security system, the whole floor above you. It's gone dark. It's draining everything. Riley looked at the footprint, then at the single, heavy steel door behind him. The lights in the chamber had gone from a dim flicker to total blackness, plunging him into absolute shadow. A deep, inhumanly resonant vibration, the same low, terrible chord from the do_not_open.mp4 file, began to rumble up through the concrete floor, shaking the dust from the ceiling. Riley raised his flashlight, spinning around wildly, but the beam couldn't cut through the total, smothering darkness that had just engulfed the chamber. He was trapped in the center of the web. The resonant vibration grew, transforming the small chamber into a vibrating drum of fear. The total darkness was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to press the air out of Riley's lungs. His flashlight, which had momentarily died during the power drain, flickered back to life, its beam weak and stuttering, a desperate, defiant candle against the void. He aimed the shaky beam at the circular floor, and the footprint was gone, replaced by the pooling shadow of the entity itself. It was massive in this confined space, taller than the ceiling, hunched and angular, the darkness so profound it seemed to pull the light into its mass. Riley drew his service pistol. "Blackwood Police. Don't move." The shadow watcher didn't move. It simply stuttered forward, not walking, but snapping from one point in space to the next with impossible speed. With the first snap, it was halfway across the room. Riley fired 3 shots, aiming center mass. The bullets were absorbed into the figure with a dull thwump, leaving no sound of impact, no blood, and no visible effect. The shots seemed only to make the entity pause, its towering form oscillating slightly, as if considering the attack. "It feeds on energy," Riley gasped, thinking rapidly. It's not physical. Bullets are useless. The Shadow Watcher snapped again, instantly filling the entire space between Riley and the heavy steel door. It was so close Riley could feel the intense, localized cold radiating from it, the same cold he'd felt touching the flash drive. The air was dead that he felt a hand-shaped pressure on his chest, even though no physical appendage was visible. It wasn't a push, it was a draw, a terrifying, localized suction that made his heart rate spike and the muscles in his legs seize up. He felt his own kinetic energy, the raw power of his body, being pulled toward the entity that he brought the flashlight up, shining the weak, struggling beam directly into the center of the entity's mass. The effect was instantaneous. The Shadow Watcher recoiled slightly, making the ground rumble again. Where the focused light hit, the darkness seemed to fray and become indistinct. The light didn't injure it, but it clearly agitated it. Light is its antithesis. Riley yelled over the vibration. It's why it only hunts when it's darkest. Realizing his small flashlight was his only defense, Riley spun and sprinted towards the closest wall. He knew he couldn't beat the entity in a physical fight, but he had to find a weakness, a source of power he could overload or destroy. That he remembered Frank's earlier report, the main server racks, the security system, the whole floor above you. The Watcher had drained the power from the floor above to materialize fully here. He scrambled up a crumbling concrete ladder leading to a thick cluster of old, high-voltage conduit lines that ran along the chamber ceiling, lines that had powered the original 1883 drainage pump. They were dead now, but they still carried residual charge. As Riley reached the top, the entity snapped right below him, letting out the terrible, low hiss. The same sound heard right before Clara's video ended. Riley looked wildly at the conduit lines. These cables were the veins leading to the heart of the old confluence point. He saw the solution in the residual energy. If the entity was absorbing power, he had to give it more than it could handle. He had to feed it until it choked. He holstered his pistol and reached for a heavy, rusting iron pry bar that was wedged between two pipes. He grabbed the bar and, with a guttural roar, swung it full force, smashing it into the oldest, thickest conduit cable, a massive, copper-laden line that was clearly grounded to the stone wall. A blinding flash of pure, blue-white electrical energy erupted from the line. The surge, the final, chaotic expulsion of residual power, ripped through the metal and the damp concrete. The effect on the Shadow Watcher was devastating. The figure didn't scream, but the terrible, low vibration spiked into a deafening, painful screech. The shadow writhed and shrank, rapidly losing its cohesive shape as the massive, uncontrolled energy surge overloaded its absorption process. The lights in the chamber flickered back on, not a steady light, but a wild, strobing pulse. Riley dropped the pry bar, the copper smell of ozone stinging his nostrils. He didn't wait. He clambered down and sprinted back to the steel door, slamming the bolt home just as the Watcher, now reduced to a flickering, dying column of black smoke, recoiled violently against the far wall. He stumbled back through the tunnels, the screeching still echoing, until he reached the elevator and collapsed against the button for the main floor. The Watcher was wounded, maybe severely, but Riley knew that the electrical surge hadn't killed the concept of a living shadow. It had only temporarily stopped its heart. Riley burst through the briefing room doors, staggering and leaning heavily against the frame. He was covered in grime, the lingering scent of ozone clinging to his uniform, and his heart was still hammering against his ribs. Evelyn rushed to him, her face pale. "Alex. You're alive. What happened down there?" "It's real, Evelyn. More real than anything I've ever seen." Riley gulped down a glass of water, his voice strained. "It's an energy parasite. It was resting in the old drainage access, the center point. I overloaded the remaining residual power in the old conduit lines." It screamed, Evelyn. A terrible, non-human screech. Evelyn quickly checked the forensic laptop. Frank's utility report just came in. A massive surge spike in the sublevels, immediately followed by the security systems on the main floor coming back online. You hit it hard, Alex. You forced it to abandon the feeding. But it's not dead, Riley countered, running a hand through his hair. It's wounded, drained, but still active. If it was forced out of its lair, it has to find a new, immediate energy source, or it will dissipate. Evelyn's eyes widened as a new data stream flashed red on her screen. Wait a minute. When the building's main power flickered back on, we got an alert. Not from the security system, but from the library system database. What alert? An access log anomaly. Just as the power was being restored, someone, or something, accessed the deepest sector of the physical police archives. The sector where you found Clara Jennings' case file. Evelyn pointed to the screen. Look at the timing. You blew the conduit at 4:32 a.m. The archive access was logged at 4:33 a.m. It's an immediate, 1-minute window. Riley straightened up, the exhaustion forgotten. The attack was a diversion. It wasn't just trying to kill me, it was buying time to access something in the archives. But it's an immaterial shadow, Evelyn. It can't pull files off a shelf. Unless, Evelyn posited, her voice low and tight, it needed to drain power from the server room above the lair to fully materialize, and then, while we were focused on the sublevels, it made a desperate dash for its true objective. They raced out of the briefing room and down to the records wing, the scene of Riley's first night on the case. The archives were secured by heavy, sliding metal doors, usually requiring a fingerprint and a keycard. The doors were closed. The alarm was silent. Riley pulled out his master key and forced the inner lock. The lights inside the vast, cold room hummed, illuminating towering shelves of paper history. Find the anomaly, Riley ordered. What was it searching for? They moved quickly to the deeper sectors, scanning the file categories. The entity had no time for a casual search. It would have gone straight for a specific target. Evelyn stopped by a shelf labeled Historical Investigations, 1900 to 1950. Here, she said, pointing to a small gap on the shelf. It's gone. It pulled a physical file. The gap was where a file box belonging to a case from 1947 should have been. The log card on the outside read, Case F47-912, Multiple Disappearances, Riverside Ward. Riley felt a cold wave wash over him. Riverside Ward. The Old Mill District. Thomas Jones' apartment in 2018 was built on the remains of Riverside. It's not just a serial predator, Alex, Evelyn stated, her eyes wide with revelation. It's building a history. It didn't want Clara's file, it wanted the details of the original pattern. The historical evidence that precedes the modern disappearances. Why? Because it's evolving, Evelyn concluded. It knows we're tracking the modern pattern. It needs the original, historical context to understand itself, or to find the key to its permanent power source, the true root of its weakness. Riley looked at the empty space on the shelf. The Watcher had fled the sublevel and rushed here, still wounded, to grab a single, vital file. It was a calculating entity, not just a monster. If it's wounded and carrying a fragile paper file, where does it go to hide and feed? Riley thought out loud. Not the archives. Not its old lair. It needs a place with high, accessible energy, and absolute darkness. Evelyn checked the city map again, cross-referencing high-power utility lines with areas of the city that see minimal foot traffic and light pollution. There's only one place nearby that fits the profile, Evelyn said, pointing to an abandoned, massive structure 5 blocks from the precinct. The old municipal power station. Decommissioned in the 1970s. It still houses the original main transformer, and all the city's major power relays pass through the abandoned conduits beneath it. It's a cathedral of dark, residual power. Riley grabbed his gear. The sun was now fully up, but the entity had the one thing they lacked: the history of its own existence. It's not just hiding, Evelyn. It's studying its next move, Riley said grimly. We're going to the power station. It has the file, and we have the only thing that can stop it: light. Riley and Evelyn arrived at the abandoned municipal power station just as the city's early morning traffic began to pick up. The building was a colossal, decaying monument of brick and tarnished steel, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the modern city. A chain-link fence, rusted and bent, was the only barrier. This is it, Evelyn confirmed, looking at a utility map on her tablet. Beneath the main floor is the original generator pit, full of decommissioned but still charged components. The energy here is immense, even dormant. It's the perfect place to hide, heal, and learn, Riley muttered, looking at the building's deep, oppressive shadows. The file it stole, Case F47-912, is its key to survival. It's studying its own historical weaknesses. Riley had stopped briefly to grab a new piece of equipment from the precinct's specialized forensics vault, a heavy-duty, military-grade strobe light and UV lamp array designed for illuminating large-scale crime scenes. If light was the antithesis of the Shadow Watcher, Riley was going to bring a sun to the darkness. They found a weak point in the fence and slipped into the neglected grounds. The air inside the power station was cold and smelled strongly of metallic dust and old insulation. They moved onto the main floor, a vast, open space dominated by massive, silent machinery, the hulking, dark shapes of the main turbines, now encased in spiderwebs and dust. The only ambient light filtered weakly through the high, grimy windows. We need to find a place of absolute darkness, Riley, Evelyn whispered. A deep shaft, a shielded transformer vault. That's where it will be reading the file and feeding. Riley led the way, his footsteps echoing unervingly in the cavernous space. He had the strobe array on his shoulder, ready to deploy. They located a heavy steel hatch near the back wall, labeled Transformer Maintenance Access, Pure Dark Zone. The hatch was not locked, but its massive bulk was slightly ajar, requiring a significant shove to open. It went this way, Riley confirmed, seeing a faint scrape mark on the dusty floor where the hatch had been dragged. He prepared the light array. Evelyn, you stay here. Monitor my movements from a distance and be ready to deploy the secondary UV flares. We need to flood this place. No, Evelyn stated firmly, her hand resting on the small emergency flare gun she had taken from Riley's bag. If it's reading the file, it is distracted, but its energy will be spiking. I'm going in with you. My job is analysis. I need to see what it's doing with the paper file. Riley didn't argue. He knew the look in her eyes, the resolve of a scientist determined to see the end of her subject. That he lowered himself into the access hole, Evelyn following close behind. They landed on a narrow catwalk suspended over a deep, bowl-shaped pit, the transformer core. It was utterly, completely dark, a void of silence. Riley activated the strobe array. The massive room was instantly, chaotically illuminated by a blinding, rapidly pulsing light. The pit below was revealed, crammed with thick, obsolete electrical wires and massive, ceramic insulators, and in the very center of the pit, huddled over a small, flickering light source, was the Shadow Watcher. It was smaller than it had been in the police sublevel, still wavering, but its shape was solidifying, drawing energy from the powerful, residual fields around the old transformers. The small light source beneath it was a piece of paper, the stolen file F47-912, glowing with a faint, unholy energy as the Shadow Watcher absorbed the historical data. the blinding strobe light did not harm the entity, but the sudden, violent shifts in light frames seemed to confuse and disorient it. It raised its long, thin head, letting out a frustrated, hissing sound. Riley shouted over the pulse of the light, "It's absorbing the paper, Evelyn. It's not just reading the history, it's absorbing the knowledge to complete its power cycle." As the light pulsed, they could see the paper file begin to curl and turn black at the edges. Dissolving into the shadow, Evelyn pointed wildly to a large, ceramic breaker box mounted on the catwalk railing near them. "The main transformer cut off. If we can shut down the residual field, we can starve it before it finishes absorbing the history." The Shadow Watcher, realizing the threat, abandoned the file. It snapped toward the catwalk, its movement still jerky but now faster, energized by the ambient power. "Keep the strobe on it, Riley. Distract it." Evelyn scrambled towards the breaker box. Riley steadied the light array, aiming the blinding pulse directly at the entity's path. "Come on, Evelyn, hurry." The Watcher was halfway to them. The intense light slowed it, forcing its movements to be more fluid and less instantaneous, but it was closing fast. As Evelyn reached the breaker box, the Shadow Watcher stopped, its immense, dark shape looming over the catwalk railing. It let out the terrifying, deep vibration, the sound of pure, unbridled power, and suddenly, the strobe light died, the bulb exploding with a small, sharp pop. Riley was plunged into instant darkness. The Watcher had found a new ability, locally disrupting the source of light. It can drain focused light now. Riley yelled into the total blackness. "Evelyn. I'm at the box." Evelyn's voice was strained. "But the cut-off lever is rusted shut. I can't move it." Riley fumbled for his small, backup tactical flashlight, but before he could switch it on, he felt the same cold, draining pressure on his side, the silent suction that stole his energy and strength. The Watcher had him. The icy, draining pressure intensified on Riley's side, pulling the warmth and energy directly out of him. He could hear Evelyn grunting as she desperately wrestled with the rusted transformer cut-off lever. "Alex. I can't move it." Evelyn shouted, her voice strained. Riley felt himself weakening, his tactical flashlight slipping from his numb fingers. The Shadow Watcher was feeding on him, regaining the power he'd drained in the sublevel. He had to stop the entity's absorption now, before it fully manifested and before Evelyn could be overpowered. He remembered the feeling of the metal pry bar exploding with residual power in the basement. Residual energy. The key wasn't the active flow, it was the ancient, stored charge. With a final surge of adrenaline, Riley ignored the draining cold and lunged not at the Watcher, but at the catwalk railing. He unclipped the UV flare gun from Evelyn's utility belt, aiming it not at the entity, but at the enormous ceramic insulator next to the breaker box, a decades-old component that had stored colossal amounts of latent electrical energy. "Stand clear, Evelyn." Riley yelled that he fired. The flare, designed to illuminate a dark crime scene, hit the ceramic insulator with a sharp, shattering impact. The result was a catastrophic surge. The flare's intense chemical heat and light fractured the insulator, releasing a violent, localized explosion of stored, highly pressurized electrical energy, not a flow, but a spontaneous discharge of pure, untamed power. The white-hot energy crackled through the confined space. The Shadow Watcher was instantly enveloped. It didn't just recoil this time, it shrieked, a high, piercing sound that was both electronic feedback and agony. The immense, dark mass vaporized for a split second, reduced to a flickering, dying silhouette. The pressure on Riley vanished, and he collapsed onto the catwalk. Evelyn, momentarily stunned by the blast, didn't hesitate. She recognized her chance. Using the remaining force of the residual energy surge, she slammed her entire body against the rusted lever. With a screech of metal on metal, the main transformer cut-off lever snapped into the OFF position. A profound, sickening silence followed. The entire pit below went utterly dead, the dormant power field now extinguished. Riley pushed himself up, his eyes adjusting to the near-total darkness, illuminated only by the faint red glow of the dying flare. The Shadow Watcher was gone. Not retreated, not hiding, but completely absent. Evelyn crawled over, checking Riley for injuries. "Did we kill it?" she whispered, staring into the dark pit. "No," Riley gasped, pointing to the edge of the pit. "Look." The stolen file, case F47-912, lay there. It was partially absorbed. The first few pages, detailing the 1947 disappearances, were blackened, curled, and brittle. But the majority of the file, the final, critical pages, were untouched. "It almost made it," Evelyn said, picking up the scorched file carefully. "It was studying its own history to find a pattern or a means of permanence, but we cut the power before it finished." Riley took the file and scanned the unblackened, final page. It wasn't a police report, it was a handwritten journal entry from a 1947 victim, July 19, 1947. "I saw it today in the archives. I snuck in late. It wasn't human then either, but it wasn't a shadow. It was a man, thin and terribly gaunt, working the night shift. He was documenting everything, writing the files on the missing himself. He looked at me, and his eyes were empty, just black wells that he wasn't collecting the files to hide the truth. He was collecting the energy of their absence. This thing, it's not a ghost of darkness. It's a cycle. It harvests the energy of the missing, then uses that energy to temporarily inhabit a frail, human host, the Watcher I saw. The host documents the kills to create a history, then passes the file to the next stage. It's a closed-loop predator. The shadow is just the transition state. Riley's blood ran cold. The Shadow Watcher wasn't just a monster, it was a system. It was the energy of absence given temporary physical form, sustained by the very records of its crimes. The man-shaped shadow was only one stage, the next was the creation of a temporary, human-like archivist to prepare for the next cycle. It was trying to learn how to find its next host, Riley whispered. The file contains the method of transitioning to the human form, the archivist stage. We stopped the human part of the cycle. But the shadow energy was still out there, dormant, waiting for a new source of power. Suddenly, Evelyn grabbed his arm, pointing toward the open hatch above them. "Alex! Look!" A fine, black mist, like pulverized soot, was slowly drifting down into the silence of the core pit. It was the residue of the entity, the fragments of the Shadow Watcher, coalescing back toward the power-dead ground. It was seeking the absolute final source of energy remaining in the environment, and it was heading straight for the only active power source left in the pit, the flickering, chemical heat and light of the dying UV flare. The fine, black mist of the Shadow Watcher's residue drifted silently, quickly, toward the dying UV flare. Its absorption was desperate and immediate. The flare's tiny, sustained energy was the only thing preventing the entity from complete dissipation. "It's consolidating again," Riley yelled, pushing himself to his feet. "It's too close to the ground, we can't get to the flare without crossing its path." Evelyn, still clutching the partially burned file, flipped frantically through the final, unscorched pages. "We have to find the weakness. The human hosts, the archivists, they must have been the entity's method of control over the energy cycle." She stopped on the last page, which contained cryptic notes and a complex, hand-drawn diagram. "I have it, Alex. The 1947 victim, the one who saw the human host, he theorized the entity is vulnerable only during the moment of transition. The shadow form is powerful but relies on absorbed energy. The human archivist form is weak but stable. To go from shadow to archivist, it needs a catalyst, a large, controlled source of sustained, passive power. Riley looked at the diagram on the file. It showed the 5 industrial confluence points arranged around a central point, the police station. That's the cycle, Riley confirmed, his mind racing. It harvests the initial energy from the 5 points, then uses the combined power of the central hub, the police station, to initiate the human transformation. But the power is cut here and in the basement. Where is the last source of passive power? Evelyn pointed to the diagram's center. It's not electrical power. The final page notes that the human transition requires sustained, focused light, not harsh, active light like the strobe, but a deep, focused source. Something that remains constant. Riley looked around the dark, defunct power station, then back at the police headquarters 5 blocks away. The archives, Evelyn. The record room. It's climate-controlled, sealed, and the fluorescent lights in the deep storage section are never turned off. They are the only constant, uninterrupted light source in the entire building. It stole the file to learn this. Evelyn realized. It planned to use its last burst of energy to snap back to the archives, use the constant, quiet light to initiate the archivist transition, and begin a new cycle, hidden in plain sight as a human. The black mist had now fully absorbed the energy of the dying flare and was beginning to form a small, dense, human-sized silhouette in the pit. The Shadow Watcher was recoalescing, preparing for its final, desperate move. It's almost ready to move. Riley yelled. We have to get back to the archives. If it successfully transitions, it becomes an undetectable human inside the police department, and the cycle starts again. They scrambled out of the transformer pit and raced out of the abandoned power station. Riley called the precinct on his secure line, praying the line hadn't been compromised. He reached a rookie officer, Officer Hayes, stationed at the front desk. Hayes. This is Detective Riley. Get to the archives. Section D, Historical Investigations. You need to disable the lighting system completely. Shut off the main circuit breaker for that section. Now. Sir, I can't leave my post, and I don't have authorization. This is a 911 order, officer. Do it now, or people are going to die. Riley barked, hanging up before the rookie could object further. Riley and Evelyn jumped back into the patrol car. As they sped toward the precinct, a flicker of movement caught Riley's eye in his rearview mirror. A single, elongated, jet-black figure was standing atop the power station's highest chimney stack. It was no longer mist, it was a pure, distinct shadow against the pale morning sky, tall and terribly thin, and then, with a soundless, terrifying velocity, it launched itself toward the heart of the city, aimed directly at the police department. The Shadow Watcher was making its final, desperate leap of the cycle. Riley had mere seconds to win the race. Riley slammed the patrol car to a halt outside the Blackwood PD headquarters. He and Evelyn sprinted inside, racing past the stunned front desk where a nervous Officer Hayes stood frozen, fumbling with his radio. The lights, Hayes. Did you kill the lights in the archives? Riley demanded, grabbing the rookie's shoulder. I tried, Detective. I got to the breaker box on the records floor, but the main lever is huge, and I couldn't move it. Hayes stammered. It's stuck. And the air just dropped, it got so cold right next to the archives door. It's here, Evelyn hissed, holding the scorched file. It made the jump. Riley looked down the hallway leading to the records wing. The air shimmered with an unnatural cold, and the sound of the fluorescent bulbs, usually a low, comforting hum, was a high-pitched, frantic whine. They burst into the archive room. It was fully lit, the ceiling bulbs blazing with maximum, constant power. The shadow watcher was in the center of the aisle, standing directly beneath the main fluorescent bank. It was taller and darker than ever, no longer a flickering mist, but a dense, shimmering pillar of pure blackness. The high-powered, focused light was flooding it, not injuring it, but catalyzing its transformation. As Riley and Evelyn watched, the outer shell of the shadow began to peel away, revealing a core. It was solidifying into the gaunt, tall figure described in the 1947 journal, The Archivist. The process was agonizingly slow, like watching a man being forged out of tar and bone. The Watcher had found the perfect light and was now completing the cycle. In minutes, it would be human, stable, and undetectable, ready to live among them and continue its harvest. The light is feeding it the transition energy. Riley yelled, pulling out his sidearm, knowing a bullet would still be useless. We need to break the source. Evelyn pointed to the ceiling above the entity. The light. We can't hit the lever, but we can destroy the bulbs above it. Break the sustained focus. Riley looked up. The fluorescent bank was high, maybe 15 feet up. He had to shoot the lights out with precision, aiming for the glass tubes. He took aim, compensating for the high trajectory. The shadow, sensing the immediate threat to its transformation, snapped its attention to Riley. A piece of the shadow detached, a long, whip-like ribbon of darkness, and lashed out at the rows of archives. With a terrific crash, a whole section of steel shelving overloaded with files collapsed, creating a massive wall of debris between Riley and the target. Riley dove behind a filing cabinet as the entity focused its remaining energy on defense. Evelyn. The file. Does it say anything about breaking the archivist state? Evelyn, pinned down by the debris, frantically scanned the final, brittle page. Yes. The archivist is weak, but the shadow form's energy is locked in its history. The history sustains the cycle. Riley looked at the file box, the Jennings, C. 2022 box, still sitting on his desk from last night. That was the modern history, the shadow's recent harvest. He pointed his pistol toward the ceiling, aiming blindly over the heap of metal and paper. He fired 3 quick shots. Pop. 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 2 bullets missed, but the third hit a transformer ballast, causing a small explosion of sparks and a sharp crack sound. The light bank above the Watcher died, sputtering into darkness. The Shadow Watcher shrieked, a painful, drawn-out cry of frustration, as its perfect, sustained light source vanished. The transformation process stalled instantly, the half-formed human shape inside the darkness dissolving back into an unstable, swirling pillar of shadow. The shadow was wounded, exposed, and deprived of the means to hide. Now, Alex. You have to break the cycle. Evelyn screamed, pointing to the original box on the desk. Burn the history. The old file wasn't enough, but the modern files, Clara's file, that is, it stored energy. Riley scrambled to the desk. He grabbed the heavy cardboard box marked Jennings, C. 2022. He didn't have time for a fire. He had to destroy the paper. He grabbed the nearest, most powerful tool available, a heavy-duty paper shredder built into the end of the desk. As the swirling shadow realized Riley's intent, it lunged, snapping across the aisle in one desperate jump. Riley didn't look up. He ripped open the Jennings box and shoved the thickest pile of reports, the entire history of the Shadow's last harvest, Clara Jennings' life, into the shredder. The machine's gears screamed as they tore into the dense paper. The Shadow Watcher hit the desk, but it wasn't a physical blow. It was the crushing, absolute cold of the drain. Riley felt his blood turn to ice, his strength leaving him in a wave of nausea, but as the shredder tore through the final reports, the energy that sustained the entity began to violently drain away. The Shadow Watcher didn't dissipate, it imploded. The black pillar shrank, convulsed, and collapsed onto the desk with a sound like dry leaves being crushed. It reduced instantly into a small, harmless pile of fine, crystalline black dust, the complete absence of energy, the end of the cycle. Silence returned to the archives, a true silence this time. The humming lights, still alive in the other sectors, suddenly felt warm. Riley collapsed against the desk, gasping, staring at the small, defeated pile of dust. Evelyn rushed to his side. "It's over," she whispered, looking at the dust. "The cycle is broken. The history is gone." Riley nodded weakly. He collected the last remnants of the entity, the black dust, in a sterile evidence bag. He looked at the chaos of the room, the collapsed shelves, the blown light fixtures, the shredded paper. He knew the official report would be a nightmare of plausible lies, but the truth was contained in the bag. He looked at Evelyn, the only witness to the terror. "We never speak of the shadow. We report a massive power surge, a structural failure in the old building, and a complete destruction of the records. And the 6 missing persons? Their files are destroyed. They stay missing." Evelyn nodded, her face grim. "They stay absent. And we make sure no one ever builds on an old confluence point again. The archives have a lot of history we need to quietly unearth." The detective and the psychologist looked at the evidence of the